Up. Yes, can we have the speakers from this afternoon and Eileen join them for the panel discussion? Oh, I got to get mine.
I doubt it.
Okay, well,
We're like separated apart. It's nice to have someone else.
this panel discussion is going to be similar to the last one in that it'll be surrounding questions that we've put forward, and you'll find those in your schedule. And we'll have the same format. What we'll do is we'll pose the questions, we'll allow people to vote, and then we'll ask the panel to say a short statement about their views of this, if they would be so kind to share them. So let's see, our affiliation. Where am I? Oh, there I am. Okay. I don't think the panel needs to weigh in on this one. It looks like the librarians have the greatest staying power. Long term, yeah.
No.
Okay, so are we? Okay, so maybe we should move on to the next question. Okay, so what percentage of research grant funds should be assigned for data storage and access? Okay, so there's a pretty wide range of opinions on this one. Yeah, very few people think 0%. A lot of less than 1, less than 5, and several less than 10. Several people don't have an opinion. So, are we locked in?
Yeah.
Okay, so Amber, do you want to start?
So it certainly depends very much on the different domain, but just in terms of being able to provision enough data access for the collaborators to do it, it seems to me like it would be reasonable to allocate as much as you could reasonably afford. I was with a group yesterday and we were doing a calculation, and in terms of the LHC funds that were used through the run-up of the construction phase, it was roughly about 10% of the construction funds went to provision for the computing in the U.S. So that's probably the upper end of the limit. For LCLS, it's probably closer to about 2%.
So I certainly agree with Amber that it's very application dependent. I mean, if part of the goal of your research is to produce vast amounts of data, it's probably reasonable that you're going to put more of a chunk of your budget towards that. But I think there's an assumption in this question that assumes that we should be paying for data out of our research grants, and that may or may not be right for everything, and there may be other ways to pay for. So I think before even maybe that's what's embedded in some of the no opinion answers, because there are many other ways that data infrastructure can be paid for, and you could say this is in part on federal funding agencies, or this is part, and it's not necessarily the case that it needs to, be assumed to be coming out of the research grant. So maybe there are lots of facilities in a particular domain and they can take less out of their, maybe there's just not a lot and they need to take a lot because they're kind of these researchers are the pioneers in kind of building data infrastructure. So it's a little bit hard to answer the question.
I would second that, third that, I guess. You really can't answer this unless you understand the nature of the data and its characteristics, in particular, its size. The two biggest cost components for data management are staff time and storage. Staffing is, to some extent, independent of size. Storage, obviously, is directly proportional to size. So you really need to factor that into the equation.
And I will fourth the comments that have been made already and just say that I treated no opinion as it depends.
So I think it should be 10%, just to be a contrarian. It's a slight, or 9.99%. I think it's difficult from a library perspective to say what percentage of a grant should go. I do know from a library perspective, the support for the long-term archive, if that's outside of the lab, it's greater than 0. And I think one of the burning questions that often comes up is what's the best way to resource that? And so for the hopes and fears slide, one of the things I was interested in is, are there researcher hopes or individual faculty hopes or fears about the best funding mechanism?
Yeah. So this reminds me a little bit of, I had the opportunity to go to India recently and speak to a small rural village about what they would, and we asked them what they would pay for electricity, and they thought about it for a while and said, we'd pay 10% of our annual income for electricity. And I thought, that's a lot more than I pay for electricity, but you know what, if I didn't have it, I may pay 10%. So I think it does depend on how badly you need it.
So the one thing I'd like to add to Victoria's point is that in an agency like DOE, where the funds are split between research and facilities, it may not be that the funds for the computing would come directly out of somebody's research funding, but whatever gets spent on the facility side for computing is less research dollars that you have available. So in some sense, all of the researchers do have incentive to try to make sure that those funds are managed to the best possible, because otherwise it's a hidden tax. So you may want to consider how much of it you would really like to devote to that.
So we move on to the next question. Suitable embargo to making source data available for open access. Ooh. Looks like we have a pretty clear winner there of no embargo. And the pretty strong second place showing for 1 year.
I have something to say.
Yeah.
So I think this is not a direct analogy to the embargo issue with publications. So there, the embargo issue really does revolve around sustainability and publisher revenue and things like that. Here, we don't have quite the same issue, but our limiting factor, I'm going to take a guess on people who didn't say immediate. The limiting factor is the researcher. So often researchers will, well, I haven't finished publishing on this data set yet. I've got 3 more papers to go. I don't want to get scooped. And you can have it when I'm done, which, is pretty much never, right? So I think that's something that we can accommodate and we can get over, though, because I do think it's important that those data are available at the time of publication for the validation and verification purposes. So maybe rethinking how we publish from a data set, or, you can maybe put multiple papers out together. We need to sort of rethink this so that the data are available. In my opinion, when you're making a finding available to the community, you also make everything, you make the finding available, including the how, including the steps, and including the data. And so that's something where we're not encumbered by this legacy of publishers sort of dragging this window wider, but we have our own kind of institutional traditions, I guess, and we're just not used to this notion of data being part of the publication process. didn't mean to skip you.
It's great to hear so much passion about this. You know, I look at this in something of a different light, though, because it just depends on, again, which science you're doing. So we were talking about the LHC, and there you have the situation where you're integrating data sets over a relatively long period of time, and then it takes the LHC analyses were relatively quick for energy physics, but it still took some considerable amount of time. And there you have the situation where you have competing experiments, and I can tell you there would be blood on the floor if you tried to open up CMS data to Atlas at this point. And CMS is putting sharing mechanisms in place, but when you have this situation where you have competing research groups looking at these kind of data sets, I think that's a case where you have to be sensitive to the issues within the community. Although certainly I agree that some people do just, for whatever reason, need or want to sit on their data. I think a year is reasonable, except in the cases where it takes a lot longer to accumulate the data sets, and the time constant is just different in that situation.
So because the mic's passing by me, I'll make another comment, which is I've done a little bit of research on this, and it seems like there is some flexibility among researchers. So there are some examples of researchers who've collected data, and it's been 10 years of observing every minutia about a worm or something. And then at the end of it, they write a book, and the research community tends to have sort of sympathy and flexibility around that. So I feel like there's sort of low-level community standards that can arise that can be sensitive to these types of things. And same when your data took a huge amount of capital intensity to produce or something, there's sort of this extra investment in there. So there's sort of these extra dimensionalities to consider with data. But my impression is the community of researchers is quite sympathetic and sensitive to this type of thing.
Well, as a repository service operator, I mean, we'll end up doing whatever our customers tell us that they want to do, but certainly from the point of view of simplifying our infrastructure and our procedures, it would be better without having embargoes to have to worry about and having to keep track of dates and encode all that into some actionable enforcement mechanisms.
In the survey that Bruce mentioned earlier that MRS and TMS issued, we didn't ask any specific questions about embargo periods for the release of data, but we got a lot of volunteer write-in answers about it. And the time spans that the respondents gave us ranged from a few weeks to a couple months prior to publication to about 6 months after publication, but no one volunteered anything that went beyond that. Now, certainly because we didn't ask it as a specific survey question, you can read into that what you like, but I thought it was worth sharing.
Yeah, I would echo what Stephen said, is that in this case, I think the repository is the tail of the dog rather than the dog itself. One interesting facet is to consider this notion of a living publication or a living data set. And there's a natural connection with what Victoria said, is when you publish an article, you want to link to the data and vice versa. So that means one or the other is typically versioned unless you can hit the go button at both times. But then there's also comments, and then there's versioning. So it's interesting to think about loading the data as early as possible and then gradually unfolding it in terms of either embargo or wider and wider access.
So this also uncovers larger issues about citation. And one of the things that research has shown as well is that researchers don't always appreciate how their data sets might get used. There's this fear of being scooped among some, not everyone. And then the reality turns out to be nobody really actually was in their head and saw that next step, because they're steeped in their research. But what happened is people came in from crystallography or from proteomics or something, and then they used the data in different ways that the original researcher didn't expect, and then the original researcher picked up additional citations, which people don't always foresee when they're thinking about the open data issue from a researcher perspective. And I think that's something where that people will learn in time, and we can sort of help disseminate. And these ideas of citation for data are incredibly important for establishing that as an incentive to share data.
Okay, thanks.
Do we have comments from the field?
Okay, yeah, I think you want one, right?
No, I just wanted to raise one area where I have seen difficulty with this, and this was the field of cladistics in biology. So the people who use this iterative methodology, they really came in and they began to use other people's data, and without really doing any primary analysis of their own, they just really went back to other people's data set and published interpreted evolution and systematic treatments of things, and in some cases really didn't know the underlying organisms because they really didn't do any of the lab work. And this engendered certain bad feelings within the field. This took place in the 1990s. And you do have things arising like that where new methodologies occur, and there are people who go back and really do reinterpretations of data without really doing any primary research. So it occasionally happens. I think there needs to be a strong citation to show who did some of the original work to give some credit where credit is due in cases like that.
Okay, good, well, thanks. Let's move on to the next questions. Should source data be peer-reviewed along with the manuscript it supports? Looks like maybe in some cases we're all wishy-washy on this one. Although very few of us have no opinion about it. So. Okay. Well, it seems like people think that we're going to have to be reviewing or reviewing data, peer reviewing data sets. So. To a certain extent. So should have some comments from the...
So one of the things I find interesting about this is should the data be peer-reviewed along with the manuscript it supports? And I do want to come back to this idea that there is a lot of valuable data out there that does not actually ever make it to publication. And so separating the two mechanisms, the publication of the data from the publication of the knowledge that goes with that, that could be something which does open up other possibilities in terms of research. So I think that's something that we should consider of not, I can't remember who it was who said it earlier, but we have very much in our minds a very fixed process for how it is data makes it to or how publications are done, and it may be time to rethink that. And so that was what prompted my maybe in some cases kind of answer.
So speaking of rethinking things, this raises this issue that comes up when you start sort of pulling back the covers on the research process and the publication process. So when you think about validation or verification of results, traditionally that's been something that has been post-publication. So if you think even in the pre-computational age, if you put a paper out, it's up to other members of the community to take your work, and then they'll go into their lab or whatnot and replicate experiments and try your stuff out. And if you take that model over to the digital age, that means something along the lines of the data's available, code's available, probably not peer-reviewed. The work hasn't been replicated before publication, maybe, and then that reproducibility is something that happens in the community after publication. And so that's the direct analogy of what we've always had. I think that's something that maybe we need to take a hard look at. Right now, my opinion is it's something of a non-starter in the system that we have now where, we heard before lunch that reviewers are so overburdened, they sort of do this cursory work. And then you tell the reviewer, oh, by the way, install this software and make sure you can get the same results and get it going on your system. I mean, I don't think, at this point, there's just not enough bandwidth among reviewers to do that. But whose responsibility this reproducibility is and where it falls in this sort of research process, I think is something to think about. I think it's natural now for it to fall post-publication given our circumstances, but going forward, I think that's an open question that we should be ready to sort of look at and find new solutions for.
Well, my thought, and I should say I'm speaking as a non-scientist. In fact, I suspect I'm one of the few art historians actually left in the room here. But that it would seem to me to data peer review would lend itself much more easily towards the post-publication model, that people who would be potentially interested in using a data set are the ones who are going to have the most at stake and the most enthusiasm and interest in performing an in-depth evaluation of the data, as opposed to trying to find people before the fact.
And piggybacking on that idea, I think the post-publication, the ability to comment, and for those who have validated, excuse me, to be able to discuss what has worked and what hasn't, because the conversations we've been having have circled around this idea of validation and that not all data is good data, and that making it a requirement to put all this data out there, especially with publication, is just going to put so much bad data out there, and we need to be able to confirm that.
So I suspect that reviewing data is unmanageable given the time constraints and the resource constraints. That said, I think the transparency of data and code is immensely valuable. So sunlight disinfects, as they say in government and laws. I think the same thing happens at least with software. So I'm also not a scientist, but we produce a lot of software. I can testify that the software we produce that is open source and released is better documented, better tested, and if there are bugs in it, they're identified more readily than if it's just within our group. So I imagine the same thing is true with data.
Okay.
You have a question.
Question. Okay.
Yeah, in a slightly different context, our kind of data, we're doing space-based solar astronomy. We'll always have an instrument paper with calibration details and instrument details that are published first, usually about the time of launch or shortly thereafter. And then that serves as a citation to the data and the data methods for the few hundred papers that follow shortly that are doing the science. But that requires a journal that is willing to accept papers for peer review that don't necessarily have new science content, but really have the basis for the data for the following papers.
Okay. So, yeah, good discussion. The next question should be, who should be responsible for ensuring long-term access to reliable source data? Ooh. Yes. Authors. Yeah, the authors is the clear winner in this case.
Quality of the data.
That's right. I think we have, or do we have any authors in the room? Yes.
Authors can't do anything long-term.
Yeah, that's true.
They'll be gone long-term.
You quoting a famous economist there? So, comments from the...
I guess
Yeah.
starting at this end this time. So I think the fact that there's 0% around authors and something everywhere else is a good indication that it has to be someone who is ready and able to do it, and individuals can't do it by definition over the long term.
I agree with that, and I think that this is one where we should have had an all or some of the above option, because you can see that there and from the discussions we had this afternoon, there really are a lot of different options that make a lot of sense. It just depends on the case.
I agree. I think it's clearly a divided and collaborative responsibility.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add, but I think you saw from my talk, many of us who provide facilities are worried that it's going to be us, and we're not entirely sure how we're going to do that within the budgets that we have.
Right. Okay, good point. Okay. What areas should the library focus on in the data management realm? Ooh. Well, we're seeing the librarians lauded for their long-term staying power again. Okay, here are comments from the panel.
So I don't have anything intelligent to say here because I haven't really thought through what the role of libraries are into the future. And that's been, for me, one of the interesting things that I've seen is in today is seeing what the publishers are starting to think of as their roles. And so I think it'll be fascinating to see what, how the libraries evolve over time. I think those of us who grew up knowing and loving libraries and the functions that they used to serve are looking very much forward to seeing how they reinvent themselves in the digital age.
So I agree with, I think it is hard to answer that question for that reason, like we don't know and that role is still evolving. However, I would be quite concerned about C and D, and the reason for that is because in my experience as a statistician and data analyst, these are generally not fixed, and these are ongoing and very sensitive to the application and subjects of research themselves. That doesn't mean that the software doing this mightn't be in a library repository, but I don't know, I feel, my sense from the question is that somehow these are fixed and then the researcher uses these tools in a fixed way, and I don't think that's really encapsulating how research works.
I think the proper answer in the abstract is all of the above, and I also think that the distribution of these results properly reflect the priority in which these things should be attended to, starting with long-term storage and access as sort of the foundational activity, and then putting off until later, or as a more discretionary activity, dealing with sort of the end user tools for analysis and visualization.
Yeah, I think long-term storage and access, but not just the technical bits, but also consulting on licensing, consulting on arrangements, advocacy within the institution is a natural and profitable role for the library. I think some of the other areas, the job is just too big, and I think libraries have long ago stopped thinking of themselves as a one-size-fits-all shop, unless they want to have a very small shop or a very niche operation indeed. And I think the appropriate strategy is to really look at integrating and coupling with curators and data scientists and tool developers in other realms. It is an ecosystem, not a system, and the library is just one node.
So we're going to try to show this as what the librarians think. Okay, about the same, yeah. Same. Yeah, okay. So let's move on to the next question, which is if all federally funded source data must be made available to everyone, will that put the United States as a competitive advantage or disadvantage relative to other countries that do not have such a policy? Did I jump a question? Oh, okay. That's an interesting answer that's emerging here from this group. They feel that giving away all our data would help us, no matter who takes it. So,
scientific data.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. It's not, you're not going to answer that. You're taking the old 10-foot pole approach to this.
Yeah, well, what I can do again is go back to what I heard from those who responded to our survey. And this was another comment question. We left it open-ended at the end. The final question was, do you have anything else you'd like to share? And in addition to peer review and standardization, this was the one that jumped out. And from the write-in comments, disadvantage would be clear. They were saying basically that we'd be giving everything else away to countries that were holding their data close, and certainly that would put us at a disadvantage. But I won't state whether I agree or disagree.
State it. So I think this is something we're still getting used to, and we're still getting the idea of open data. We're still kind of getting our heads around it. This also comes back to the point of science policy as well. So on March 5th, I testified at a hearing on research integrity in front of the House Science Committee, and some of the members of Congress raised this point, and they had really big concerns about American competitiveness being threatened and so on. And China is going to get our research data or whatnot. And in my opinion, so there's a couple of things, and one is just the acceleration to our own science from open data, I think would far outswamp and the integrity to the scholarly record, whatever, if there are disadvantages or whatever happens in other countries. And don't forget already that science is so deeply collaborative. It's not like an American scientist works with Americans and, this is something where we're always on international teams and we're always traveling internationally, and it would be very weird, the idea of not sharing my research because of these barriers. I mean, that doesn't exist in science today. And so to me, this is something that it reminded me of that hearing and what the people in Congress are dealing with, like I mentioned in my talk, with these issues of entrepreneurship and competitiveness and economic growth and so on, that are somehow mismatched and don't quite translate to the reality that we face in the way we operate as scientists. And I don't see any threat at all. I mean, and also it's kind of a non-issue. Like if we're headed towards open data, and what are we going to screen IP addresses for who get? I mean, it's just weird, right? It doesn't make any sense.
So the international collaboration point was one that I was going to make. Another one I'd like to make is that in the neutron scattering and the light source communities, in Europe in particular, because they knew they weren't going to have, quite the superior facilities that the U.S. was building at the time, they actually invested a lot more into computing for those facilities and coming up with policies to make it easier for the researchers to share their data. And they viewed that as something which gave them a competitive advantage in an era when they didn't hold the best facilities. So that, I think, is a very foresighted way of looking at
a competitive advantage in science, or
a competitive advantage in science, because they felt like access to the data would enable more, better intellectual thought.
Right.
So
okay, maybe I misinterpreted the question. I thought they meant competitive, like America versus the world or something, like in terms of economic growth and entrepreneurship.
Well, I interpret it as a science. Well, I think of science as being competitive.
But no, that's right. I just normally, when you hear this kind of thing, I just sort of thought of economic competitiveness, but maybe I misinterpreted it.
Maybe my head is just in the sand. I wasn't thinking in those terms at all.
Okay, should we move on to the next question? So this one is, how far down on the data pyramid what data should be made available for open access? Okay. Well, it's a mixed story. Some say all, and then supporting all data that could possibly support conclusions from a paper, and then very few people said no data. So I guess everyone here who took the time today to come to this workshop and to stay to the very last minute is willing to share their data. So comments from the panel.
So I actually went for the data that supports publications. And the reason I did that was that's something that's easier to understand than all data, and what falls in the bucket of data is a little more clear. And it also is somehow congruent with our model of publishing already, and the idea of scholarly communication. And what I mean by that is you have a paper tethered to a data set in some sense. And the paper's not designed this way, but you can think of that as you're sort of, in a sense, your research narrative. So there's it's not a data documentation paper, but there's some explanation of the data, some contextualization for that data. And so I think tying those together is something that's very productive for science. So that's why I went for that one.
These don't strike me as the best criteria to use for distinguishing what should be kept or shared. I mean, because it doesn't really capture any sort of questions regarding the potential utility, the value, the uniqueness of the data, which would seem to me to be much more important. Although of these choices, perhaps data supporting publications is the one that would come closest to that, but it's a pretty rough proxy, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think it's, from the point of view of the faculty, it's difficult to state clearly what data for every case would be useful to store. So.
And I would also support data supporting publication simply because it's easier to define and it's clear.
I think one of the most important roles a librarian has is selection, so it's determining what should be saved in a general collection. One of the most important roles an archivist has is determining what can be thrown away, because preserving everything doesn't seem tenable. I would agree with Stephen. I think the B is probably best indicative of some selection criteria, and it seems to me that that's going to be critical, simply because A, it doesn't work, and C and D are too few.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Question.
Thanks. I'm Pat Burkett in physics here at Stanford. I actually chose A, but maybe to solve a problem that needs to be solved another way. And because part of the selection process that goes into B is what the authors choose to publish. And there are some fields in which negative results are standard to publish. Actually, in particle physics, a lot of our results are negative, and they're very important because they limit theories. But there are other cultures or other areas where people just cannot get negative results published, and so only the positive results get published. So I think that needs to be solved somehow. And so I chose A because of that, but it might be taking the wrong hammer to that problem. I thought that the registered reports we heard about earlier, where papers are reviewed before the data collection and the analysis, so that you say, this is what I'm going to do, so therefore that paper gets published no matter what you find, is maybe a better way to solve that problem. But that's something where I think if we got more data out there, it would be easy to scrutinize for negative results as well.
That actually went through my mind as well, and I wavered because I think that problem also needs to be solved. And the other one that this doesn't solve, and I think our discussion doesn't solve either, is the researcher who tries many different models until one works, and you never sort of learn about all those other ones that happened, and if they happened on data sets. But I think you're right that this is a little too blunt of a hammer to really solve that. But those are also very serious problems that have come with the sort of digitization of science.
Hi, I'm Jean Deacon. I'm the archivist at SLAC and one of only a couple of government people here this afternoon. And our category was eliminated in the afternoon, I noticed. I don't know what that means, but I would just like to point out that data that is the product of federally funded scientific research is a federal record or government record. And those records are scheduled by the agency that funds the particular discipline. And the schedules deal with data. There are existing schedules now that deal with Department of Energy data, that schedule it depending upon the importance of the experiment, and they deal with raw data, summarized data, and published data. So that's something that I think needs to be added into the conversation. NASA has a record schedule, NIH has a record schedule, NSF has a record schedule. So this really needs to be looked at from the point of view of, do these schedules, are these schedules known? Are they accurate? Do they apply in the current environment? And do people know enough about them? Clearly, people in this room do not. Thank you.
So the last question comes from the, sort of an engineering perspective, where a lot of our work is actually co-funded by the government and companies as well. We often have industrial partners in our research. So, and this, I've heard this worry expressed in discussions in the workshop we had with at the MRS meeting. So we'll look at what people feel about this. Will requirement to make data open access help or discourage industrial participation? What's that?
You needed a none of the above.
Oh, yeah, we did. You're right. Yeah, it looks like we've gotten 2/3, 1/3. It's easy to add up to 100. Yeah. Looks like only 3 people voted. Okay, so maybe the panelists could opine on this issue as well.
So this is a loaded question. What it's really asking us about is, how do you feel about Bayh-Dole, is what it's really asking us about.
How do we feel about what?
The Bayh-Dole Act. And so this was an act that was passed in 1980, and it encouraged and made it legal and for universities to take ownership of inventions that happened by their researchers and faculty. And you all, when you started at Stanford, signed this invention form that would sign all the rights to your inventions over to Stanford, as did all university researchers and so on. And 1980 is key here, because this is something where I'm sure nobody in Congress was thinking about the dawn of the digital age at that point, and they were probably thinking about drug development and other issues that Bayh-Dole has had a huge impact on. And so now it starts to become an issue, because for at least two reasons. And one is it has made it very, it's engendered this collaboration with companies, and now it's it's munged this line between being a scientist and being an entrepreneur or researcher, and I think those are quite different hats. I mean, both are great, but I don't think that line should be blended quite the way it is. And then the other thing that's happening is now software patents are a big deal and very real, and that's something where we've had code as part of the discussion, and software that goes to reproducibility and scientific transparency. And if universities and institutions think that's something patentable that they want to retain the rights over, and you can't go open, then I think that's a real threat to science and transparency and reproducibility. And so there's this direct conflict with Bayh-Dole. And so whether or not it hurts, and it may it may fix some of these relationships with industry, it may clarify the roles having open access. But this question is worded that it's happening during the research process and research collaboration. It doesn't take into account, too, I can imagine lots of industry development and entrepreneurship and all this economic growth and all that stuff Congress and the White House are all interested in happening around the open data. So there's also this balancing, like if it does have a negative effect or discourage some research pre-publication, like these collaborations between universities and industries, there's a cost-benefit analysis. I would guess it's probably going to be outweighed downstream with sort of the generative activity around open data, open code, results that are actionable, and open publications. It's a really complicated issue.
Bob Beyer, Stanford. So this is twice Bayh-Dole has been brought up this afternoon, which I find interesting. Those of us who lived in the pre-Bayh-Dole era know what was not working, and what wasn't working is government owned all data. And as a consequence, no one would patent anything, and there was no transition at all of knowledge into the commercial stream. With Bayh-Dole, there are some benefits, at least to the general economy. I find it interesting the take on data and that it might lead to, quote, lack of openness. But in fact, universities have protected themselves by having a 90-day limit on keeping information closed for purposes of patent only. And once the 90 days is over, all information that's been generated in the research is open information. And so I didn't interpret this question as in any way interacting with Bayh-Dole because of the way the universities have handled their openness and research policy.
Well, there's a difference between how universities have handled it and how faculty believe it's being handled too. And so what you've said is not always clearly understood. And many faculty have told me that I don't want to open my code because I want to start a company around it and I want to sort of build it and so on. And there are all sorts of, like this is built into the system. There's a 1-year filing after you've, say, released the code that you can still achieve a patent on it. But these things aren't well known. And there's this sort of generalized fear of being open around possibly patentable materials, in my opinion.
Okay, other comments about this question or any of the other questions or issues that came up in today's? Anything we missed? And I see we're all winding down in energy level. So I think we have our organizers going to give us a few last words. Thank you for the panel members. Great job.
This will be brief, and then there's an optional YouTube video if we can get it running on data access and management. I think it's been a very interesting day with a wide range of opinions on both the manuscript and data access. It's over here. No, it's on that side. But I'd like to close by thanking my co-organizers and also in particular thanking Sarah LaFord, who really put in a heroic effort the last couple of months. If we could take a minute to get it. I would like to invite you to stick around for some refreshments. We have outside a brief reception after this where we can continue the dialogue. And this is perfectly optional, but it is an interesting YouTube video that my daughter pointed out to me on data sharing and management access. And it's a delightful, go ahead. Delightful video. So this is optional, and I will see you out back. So thank you again for coming. And is that going to work? Yeah.